I thought I was leaving my children a legacy of love, sacrifice, and everything I'd worked for my entire life. Instead, I discovered they'd already divided up my assets while planning my funeral. My name is Leslie Brown, and this is how I learned that the 3 children I'd given everything to had been counting down the days until my death while I was still very much alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like before everything unraveled. It was a Tuesday morning in September 2023, and I was standing in my kitchen at dawn, just like I had every morning for the past 47 years. The same kitchen where I'd raised 3 children, where I'd celebrated their first steps, their graduations, their wedding days. The kitchen that had been the heart of the Brown family home on Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio. At 71 years old, I still woke up at 5:30 every morning. Not because I had to anymore, but because my body had been trained by decades of getting up before everyone else to make sure their world ran smoothly. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of my life. The old coffee maker gurgling to life, the newspaper hitting the front porch with a soft thud, the gentle hum of the refrigerator that had been working faithfully for 15 years. I'd lived in this house since 1978, when my late husband Frank and I bought it as newlyweds, with dreams bigger than our bank account. Frank had been gone for 8 years now, taken by a heart attack that came without warning on a Thursday afternoon while he was mowing the lawn. But even in his absence, I'd maintained our home like a shrine to the family we'd built together. The living room still held Frank's favorite recliner, the brown leather chair, where he'd watch baseball games and help the kids with their homework. The dining room table, solid oak that we'd saved for months to buy, had hosted countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings. Every room in this house told the story of a woman who had dedicated her entire existence to being the perfect wife and mother. I wasn't just Leslie Brown. I was Frank's widow, Michael's mother, Sandra's mother, Robert's mother. For decades, that had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Michael, my oldest at 45, lived 30 minutes away in the suburbs with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage daughters. He worked in corporate finance, had done well for himself, owned a beautiful colonial with a 3-car garage and a pool. Sandra, 42, had moved to California after college and become a successful real estate agent in San Diego. She'd never married, claimed she was too busy building her career to settle down. Robert, my baby at 39, lived right here in Riverside, just 10 minutes from me. He managed a car dealership, had 3 kids with his wife Tracy, and had always been the one I could count on to stop by regularly. Or so I thought. That particular Tuesday morning, I was preparing for what had become our monthly family tradition, Sunday dinner at Mom's house. Even though the kids were grown with families of their own, I'd insisted we maintain this ritual. Every first Sunday of the month, they'd all come home with their families, and I'd cook their favorite meals just like when they were children. For Michael, that meant pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the same recipe I'd perfected when he was 12, and going through a growth spurt that seemed to require constant feeding. For Sandra, it was my famous lasagna, the one she'd begged me to make for every birthday until she left for college. For Robert, it was fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, comfort food that reminded him of Sunday dinners after church when he was little. I'd spend the entire week planning these dinners. Tuesday was for making the grocery list, carefully writing down every ingredient I'd need. Wednesday was shopping day, where I'd drive to 3 different stores to get the freshest vegetables, the best cuts of meat, the particular brand of pasta that Sandra preferred. Thursday and Friday were for prep work, cleaning the house until it sparkled, polishing the good china, making sure everything was perfect. The house had to be immaculate for these gatherings. I'd vacuum every room, dust every surface, scrub every bathroom until it gleamed. I'd arrange fresh flowers from my garden in the dining room, set the table with the wedding china that Frank and I had received 47 years ago, and make sure there were enough chairs for everyone, including the grandchildren. On Saturday, I'd start the actual cooking, homemade bread that would fill the house with the smell of yeast and warmth. Desserts made from scratch, because store-bought never tasted the same. I'd prepare side dishes that I knew each family member loved, trying to accommodate everyone's preferences and dietary restrictions. By Sunday morning, I'd be exhausted but exhilarated. This was my purpose, my joy, my reason for being. Feeding my family, bringing them together, maintaining the traditions that Frank and I had started when the children were small. The thing about being a mother is that it becomes so fundamental to who you are that you can't imagine existing without it. For 45 years, since Michael was born, every decision I'd made had been filtered through the lens of what was best for my children. When Frank and I had the opportunity to move to Florida for his job when the kids were in high school, I'd convinced him to stay because I didn't want to disrupt their lives. When Sandra wanted to go to an expensive private college in California, I'd taken a part-time job at the library to help pay for it, even though Frank thought we couldn't afford it. When Robert was going through his divorce 5 years ago, I'd let him and the kids move in with me for 8 months, turning my peaceful retirement into a chaotic household of crying children and custody battles. I'd never questioned these sacrifices. They hadn't felt like sacrifices at the time. They'd felt like love in action, like the natural expression of what it meant to be a mother. My children's happiness had always been more important than my own comfort, their needs more pressing than my wants. Even after Frank died, when well-meaning friends suggested I might want to downsize, maybe move to a senior community where I could make new friends and have fewer responsibilities, I'd dismiss the idea immediately. This house was my children's heritage. These were the rooms where they'd grown up, where their children came to visit Grandma, where family memories lived in every corner. The photo albums that filled 3 closets told the story of a woman who had documented every moment of her children's lives with obsessive devotion. First steps, first words, first days of school, graduation ceremonies, wedding days, the births of grandchildren. I'd been the family historian, the keeper of memories, the one who made sure nothing important was forgotten. My refrigerator was covered with pictures of my grandchildren, report cards, artwork, soccer schedules, dance recitals. I knew every child's favorite food, their allergies, their fears, their dreams. I attended every school play, every sporting event, every birthday party. When Michael's daughter Emma was struggling with math, I'd hired a tutor. When Sandra needed help with a down payment on her first house, I'd withdrawn money from my retirement savings. When Robert's son Jake wanted to go to baseball camp, I'd paid the fees without being asked. This was what love looked like to me. Constant availability, endless generosity, unwavering support regardless of the cost to myself. I measured my worth as a mother by how much I could give, how many problems I could solve, how indispensable I could make myself to their lives. Frank used to joke that I loved the kids more than I loved him, and maybe there was some truth to that. Not because I didn't adore my husband, but because parental love felt more urgent, more necessary. Frank was my partner, my equal, my choice. But the children were my responsibility, my legacy, my reason for existing. After Frank died, that sense of purpose became even more intense. The kids rallied around me immediately, of course. They helped with the funeral arrangements, sorted through Frank's belongings, made sure I wasn't alone too much in those first difficult months. Michael handled the insurance paperwork and helped me understand our financial situation. Sandra flew in from California and stayed for 2 weeks, cooking meals and organizing the house. Robert checked on me daily, sometimes stopping by after work just to make sure I was okay. But as the months turned into years, I noticed their attention shifting back to their own lives, as it should have. They had jobs and mortgages and children's activities to manage. They couldn't remain in crisis mode forever, just because their mother was lonely. I understood that intellectually, but emotionally, I'd grown dependent on feeling needed. So I'd started creating reasons for them to stay involved. Small home repairs that I claimed I couldn't handle alone, even though I'd been perfectly capable of fixing things when Frank was alive. Doctor's appointments that I insisted I needed someone to drive me to, despite the fact that I was still a confident driver. Financial questions that I pretended to find confusing, though I'd been managing our household budget for decades. I told myself I wasn't being manipulative. I was just maintaining connections with my children, making sure our relationships remained strong. But looking back now, I can see that I was slowly training them to see me as helpless, as someone who couldn't function without their constant intervention. The monthly family dinners had become the highlight of my existence. For one Sunday each month, My house would be full of laughter and conversation, and the chaos that came with having 3 families under one roof. The grandchildren would run through the rooms that had once echoed with their parents' footsteps. The adults would catch up on each other's lives, share photos, discuss plans and problems and everyday concerns. I'd hover in the kitchen and the dining room, making sure everyone had enough to eat, refilling drinks, clearing plates, orchestrating the gathering like a conductor leading an orchestra. These dinners made me feel essential again, reminded me that I was still the matriarch of the Brown family, still the center around which everyone orbited. Between these monthly gatherings, I'd maintain contact through phone calls and texts, always framing my communications around their needs rather than my loneliness. I'd call Michael to ask about his daughter's activities, call Sandra to hear about her latest real estate deals, call Robert to check on his kids' school progress. I'd send care packages to Sandra in California, babysit Robert's children when he and Tracy needed date nights, and always be available when anyone needed anything. My calendar revolved entirely around their schedules. I'd plan my grocery shopping around Michael's lunch breaks in case he wanted to stop by. I'd schedule my hair appointments and doctor visits around times when Robert might need childcare. I'd stay home on weekends in case Sandra called from California and wanted to talk. This wasn't living, though I didn't recognize it at the time. This was existing in the spaces between other people's lives, finding purpose only in how useful I could be to others. I'd become so accustomed to defining myself through my relationships to my children that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be a complete person on my own. The house that had once been filled with the energy of a growing family had become a museum of memories, perfectly preserved but somehow lifeless.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I'd maintained Frank's office exactly as he'd left it, down to the coffee mug on his desk and the half-finished crossword puzzle beside his reading chair. The children's bedrooms remained frozen in time, decorated with posters from their teenage years and shelves full of trophies and awards they'd left behind when they moved out. I'd convinced myself that this preservation was about honoring the past, about maintaining a sense of continuity for the family. But really, it was about refusing to accept that the most important phase of my life was over. I was a mother whose children no longer needed mothering, a wife whose husband was gone, a woman who had never learned to exist independently. My days had developed a predictable rhythm that revolved around maintaining the house, tending my garden, and staying available for whatever my children might need. I'd wake up early and clean rooms that didn't need cleaning, cook elaborate meals for one person, and spend hours on the phone with neighbors and old friends, discussing the same topics over and over again. The only time I felt truly alive was when one of my children called with a problem I could help solve or a request I could fulfill. When Michael mentioned that Jennifer was stressed about planning their daughter's sweet 16 party, I immediately offered to handle the decorations and catering. When Sandra was house hunting for clients and mentioned being tired of hotel stays, I suggested she stay with me during her visits to Ohio, even though it meant a 2-hour drive each way to her appointments. When Robert's washing machine broke and he was worried about the expense, I insisted on buying them a new one. These opportunities to be useful felt like validation of my worth, proof that despite my age and widowhood, I still had value to offer. I measured the success of my days by how helpful I'd been, how many problems I'd solved, how indispensable I'd made myself. What I didn't realize was that my constant availability and endless generosity were teaching my children to see me not as a person with my own needs and desires, but as a resource to be utilized. I was training them to think of me as someone whose primary purpose was to serve their convenience, someone who existed to make their lives easier without expecting anything in return. I'd also unknowingly created a dynamic where my children felt obligated to include me in their lives, rather than genuinely wanting my company. The monthly dinners had become a duty they performed, rather than a joy they anticipated. My phone calls had become interruptions they tolerated, rather than conversations they valued. My offers of help had become expectations they couldn't refuse without feeling guilty. But on that Tuesday morning in September, as I stood in my kitchen planning another elaborate family dinner, I still believed I was living a life of purpose and meaning. I still thought my sacrifices were appreciated, my love was valued, and my constant devotion was creating the kind of family bonds that would last forever. I had no idea that my children had long since stopped seeing me as their beloved mother, and had started seeing me as an obligation, a burden, and eventually, an inheritance waiting to happen. I had no idea that while I was planning their favorite meals and maintaining their childhood home as a shrine to our family history, they were calculating the value of my assets and discussing how much longer they'd have to wait before they could claim what they considered theirs. The woman standing in that kitchen, lovingly planning another family gathering, was about to discover that the children she'd sacrificed everything for had been planning her exit from their lives with the same methodical care she'd once put into planning their birthday parties. But first, there was dinner to prepare. There were always dinners to prepare, messes to clean, needs to meet, and love to give to people who had stopped seeing it as love and started seeing it as their due. That realization was still weeks away. For now, I was still Leslie Brown, devoted mother and grandmother, keeper of family traditions, and the woman who believed that love meant never saying no to the people who mattered most. I was about to learn that sometimes the people who matter most to you don't think you matter at all. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a Thursday afternoon in October, when I decided to surprise Robert with his favorite apple pie. He'd mentioned the week before that Tracy was working extra shifts at the hospital, and he was feeling overwhelmed managing the kids' schedules on his own. Being the devoted mother I'd always been, I thought a homemade pie and an offer to help with dinner would brighten his day. I'd spent the morning at the farmer's market, selecting the perfect Honeycrisp apples, and had invested hours in making the flaky crust that had won praise at church bake sales for decades. The pie was still warm when I loaded it carefully into my car and drove the familiar route to Robert's house, humming along to the oldies station and anticipating his grateful smile. Robert lived in a modest, ranch-style home in one of Riverside's newer developments, the kind of neighborhood where young families pushed strollers along sidewalks and children's bicycles dotted front yards. I'd helped him with the down payment when he and Tracy bought the house 6 years ago, proud to contribute to my son's stability and my grandchildren's future. As I pulled into his driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street, a sleek black sedan that looked expensive and out of place in this middle-class neighborhood. I thought nothing of it at first. Tracy had colleagues from the hospital who occasionally stopped by, and Robert knew people from the dealership who might visit. I gathered the pie and a small bag of groceries I'd picked up for them, items I'd noticed they were running low on during my last visit. Fresh milk, the good coffee that Robert preferred, some of those organic snacks the grandchildren loved. Small gestures that I hoped made their lives a little easier. The front door was unlocked, which was typical for Robert's household during the day. I'd been letting myself in for years, usually calling out as I entered so I wouldn't startle anyone. But as I stepped into the foyer, I heard voices coming from the living room, and something in their tone made me pause instead of announcing my presence. "The house is worth at least $400,000 in today's market," a man's voice was saying, crisp and professional. "Maybe more, depending on recent updates and the condition of the foundation." "She's kept it in perfect condition," Robert replied, and my heart swelled with pride for a moment before the context registered. "Mom's obsessive about maintenance. New roof 5 years ago, furnace replaced 3 years back, fresh paint every other year." "Excellent. That'll help with a quick sale. What about personal property, jewelry, artwork, collectibles?" I felt my stomach drop as understanding began to dawn. They were talking about my house, my belongings, as if I were already gone. I pressed myself against the wall, hidden from view but close enough to hear every word. "Nothing too valuable," Robert continued, his tone casual, matter-of-fact. "Some antique furniture that might be worth something. She's got Dad's watch collection, but most of it's sentimental rather than expensive. Her jewelry is mostly costume stuff, except for her engagement ring, and a pearl necklace Dad gave her for their 25th anniversary. We'll want to get appraisals on anything that might have resale value," the stranger said. I could hear papers rustling, the scratch of pen on paper. "What's the timeline looking like?" "Honestly?" Robert's voice lowered, but I could still hear him clearly. "She's 71 and has been going downhill since Dad died. More forgetful, more dependent on us for everything. I give it maybe 2 years, 3 at the outside." The pie dish in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. 2 years. My own son was sitting in his living room with what was obviously an estate planner or real estate agent, calculating how much longer I had to live and how much money my death would generate. The real challenge, Robert continued, is going to be my siblings. Michael thinks he deserves the biggest share because he's the oldest and helped with some of Mom's finances after Dad died. Sandra's been hinting that she should get more because she's not married and doesn't have the same support system we do. Standard family dynamics, the professional voice responded smoothly. That's why it's smart to plan ahead. Has your mother expressed any preferences about distribution of assets? Robert laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Mom doesn't think about stuff like that. She's always been more focused on taking care of everyone else than planning for the future. She probably assumes we'll just figure it out fairly when the time comes. They always do. Meanwhile, estate taxes could eat up a significant portion if proper planning isn't in place. What about her current financial management? Is she still handling her own accounts? For now, but she's getting shakier about it. She asked me to help her balance her checkbook last month, which she's never needed before. And she's been getting confused about some of her bills. I think within the next year we'll need to start taking over more of her financial responsibilities. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. I'd asked Robert to help with my checkbook because the new bank statements had a different format that I found confusing, not because I was losing my mental faculties. I'd mentioned being unsure about a bill because the electric company had changed their payment system to online only, and I was trying to navigate their website. But Robert had interpreted these completely normal adjustments as signs of cognitive decline, evidence that I was becoming incompetent and would soon need to be managed like a child. What about medical considerations? The stranger asked. Any significant health issues we should factor into the timeline? She's in decent shape for her age, Robert replied, but she's been having some dizzy spells lately, high blood pressure, which runs in the family. She's on medication for that, and cholesterol. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but at her age, things can change quickly. The dizzy spells had been minor, occasional episodes that my doctor had attributed to a change in blood pressure medication. We'd adjusted the dosage and they'd mostly resolved. But Robert was presenting them as harbingers of serious decline, symptoms of a woman whose time was running out. The key is positioning ourselves as concerned children looking out for an aging parent. The professional continued. If we need to pursue conservatorship at some point, we want documentation showing a pattern of increasing dependence and declining capacity. Conservatorship. The word hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning for my death. They were planning to take control of my life while I was still living it. I don't think it'll come to that, Robert said. Mom's always been cooperative about family decisions. She trusts us completely. When the time comes, she'll probably be grateful to have us handle the complicated stuff. Still, it's good to be prepared. I'll draw up some preliminary documentation. In the meantime, keep track of any instances where she seems confused or needs extra help. Photos of the house's condition, records of her financial management, anything that supports the narrative we might need later. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly. The bag of groceries in my left hand suddenly felt like evidence of my own pathetic existence. Here I was, bringing fresh milk and organic snacks to a son who was cataloging my decline for legal purposes. What about the other siblings? The stranger asked. Are they on board with this approach? Michael's definitely interested in getting things organized. He's the practical one, very focused on maximizing the financial outcome for everyone. Sandra's harder to read since she's so far away, but she's mentioned wanting to make sure Mom's assets are protected and distributed fairly. Protected. As if I were a danger to my own assets, as if my continuing to live in my own house and manage my own money was somehow threatening to their inheritance. I'll prepare proposals for all three of you, the professional said. Individual meetings might be best initially, then we can bring everyone together once we have a unified strategy. They had developed a strategy for managing my life and death as if I were a business acquisition rather than their mother. Sounds perfect, Robert said. I really appreciate you being so discreet about this. Mom can't know we're having these conversations. She'd be hurt and probably defensive. She still sees herself as the one taking care of us, instead of the other way around. Completely understandable. Most elderly parents struggle with accepting their changing roles. It's actually kindest to handle these preparations without involving them in the emotional complexity. Elderly parent. Changing roles. Emotional complexity. They were discussing me like I was a problematic puzzle to be solved, rather than a human being with feelings and rights and opinions about my own future. I heard chairs creaking, the sounds of papers being gathered and briefcases being zipped. The meeting was ending, and I needed to get out of the house before Robert discovered I'd overheard their entire conversation. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped back through the front door and hurried to my car, leaving the pie and groceries on the porch steps. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I saw the black sedan pulling out behind me, the estate planner or lawyer or whatever he was, heading off to document my decline and plan my financial dismantling. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and shock. Every assumption I'd held about my relationship with my children was crumbling around me. The monthly family dinners, the constant phone calls, the eager acceptance of my help and generosity, none of it had been motivated by love or genuine desire for my company. It had all been performance. Maintenance of a relationship with someone they saw as their future financial security. I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house that Frank and I had bought with such hope and excitement 45 years ago. The house where I had raised 3 children, hosted countless gatherings, created what I thought were precious family memories. The house that Robert was already pricing for a quick sale after my funeral. Inside, everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning. The kitchen was still spotless, the dining room table still set with fresh flowers from my garden, the living room still arranged with the furniture that had been our family's gathering place for decades. But somehow, it all felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that my children saw it not as my home but as their inheritance. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them through Robert's eyes. The antique furniture that might have resale value. The artwork that would need to be appraised. The collectibles that were mostly sentimental but might generate some cash. Every item in my house had been mentally cataloged and assigned a monetary value by children who were supposed to love me. Frank's office, which I'd preserved exactly as he'd left it, suddenly seemed like a shrine to naivete. I'd maintained it as a memorial to our life together. But my children probably saw it as valuable square footage being wasted on sentiment. The books would be donated or discarded. The furniture sold or distributed. The personal papers sorted through for anything financially relevant. My bedroom, where Frank and I had shared 43 years of marriage, where I'd grieved his loss and slowly rebuilt my life as a widow, was just another room to be emptied and prepared for sale. The family photos covering every surface were just clutter to be dealt with. The clothes I'd collected over decades were just items to be bagged for donation. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to process what I'd learned. My children weren't evil people. They weren't monsters plotting my demise. They were practical adults who saw an aging parent as a responsibility to be managed and a financial opportunity to be optimized. They probably told themselves they were being responsible, planning ahead, protecting everyone's interests, including mine. But the casualness of Robert's tone, the easy way he discussed my timeline and declining capacity, the complete absence of love or concern in his voice when he calculated my remaining years, that revealed a fundamental shift in how my children saw me. I wasn't their beloved mother anymore. I was their elderly dependent, their financial asset, their burden to be borne until the profitable conclusion. The most devastating part was recognizing my own role in creating this dynamic. By making myself constantly available, endlessly generous, and completely focused on their needs, I trained my children to see me as a resource rather than a person. By never expressing my own needs or boundaries, I'd taught them that I didn't have any. By making their happiness my only priority, I'd demonstrated that my own happiness was irrelevant. I'd spent so many years being whatever they needed me to be, supportive mother, helpful grandmother, financial safety net, emotional caretaker, that I'd forgotten to be Leslie Brown, individual human being with her own desires and dignity. The phone rang, interrupting my spiral of realization. The caller ID showed Robert's name, and for a moment I considered not answering. But old habits die hard, and I picked up on the 4th ring. "Hi, Mom." Robert's voice was warm and cheerful, the same tone he'd used for years when calling to check on me. "How's your day going?" "It's been fine, honey," I managed, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "How about yours?" "Busy but good. Listen, I stopped by the house earlier and found a pie and some groceries on the porch. Did you drop those off?" He knew perfectly well I had. He'd probably seen my car in the driveway, but he was pretending ignorance, giving me an opportunity to explain without admitting he'd been caught in the middle of planning my future. "Yes, I made your favorite apple pie and thought you might need a few things from the store. But when I got there, it seemed like you had company, so I didn't want to interrupt." "Oh, that was just a guy from work helping me with some paperwork. Nothing important. You should have come in." Nothing important. A meeting about my estate planning, my competency, my life expectancy was nothing important. "That's okay, sweetheart. I know you're busy. I'll try to catch you another time. Are you sure you're feeling all right, Mom? You sound a little off." The question that a few hours ago would have touched me with its apparent concern now felt like data collection. Was I exhibiting signs of confusion or distress that could be documented as evidence of decline? "I'm fine, Robert. Just tired. I think I'll have an early dinner and go to bed." "Okay, but call me if you need anything. And Mom, thanks for the pie and groceries. You didn't have to do that, but it's really thoughtful." Thoughtful, as if my gesture of love was just a nice convenience, rather than an expression of how much I cared about his well-being. After I hung up, I realized that Robert had no idea I'd overheard his meeting. He was probably congratulating himself on how smoothly he'd handled the situation, how naturally he'd covered for the estate planner's visit. He thought he was protecting me from the emotional complexity of knowing that my children were planning my life around my death. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. Instead of cooking an elaborate dinner that would generate leftovers for days, I opened a can of soup and made a simple sandwich. Instead of watching the evening news while planning the next day's activities, I sat in Frank's chair and tried to remember who Leslie Brown had been before she became Mrs. Frank Brown and mother to Michael, Sandra, and Robert. The woman I remembered seemed like a stranger now. She'd been a high school English teacher who loved literature and theater. She'd directed school plays and sponsored the poetry club. She'd had opinions about books and politics and movies. She'd enjoyed traveling with Frank, trying new restaurants, attending concerts at the local amphitheater. When had I stopped reading for pleasure? When had I stopped having interests that didn't revolve around my family's needs? When had I stopped being a complete person and started being just a support system for other people's lives? More importantly, when had my children stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an asset to be managed? The realization that was beginning to form in my mind was both terrifying and liberating. If my children had already written me off as a declining elderly woman whose primary value was financial, then I had nothing left to lose by disappointing their expectations. If they were planning my future without consulting me, then perhaps it was time for me to start making my own plans. For the first time in decades, I fell asleep that night thinking about what I wanted, rather than what others needed from me. It would take several more weeks for me to discover just how deep my children's betrayal went, but that overheard conversation had cracked open a door that could never be closed again. The devoted mother who had baked that apple pie was dying, and in her place, someone much more dangerous was beginning to emerge. Someone who understood that love given without respect received was not love at all, but exploitation with a pretty name. The phone call I received 3 days later from Michael would prove that Robert's meeting hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated campaign that all 3 of my children had been conducting behind my back for months. "Hi, Mom." Michael's voice carried the same artificial warmth that Robert's had, the tone of someone managing a difficult situation rather than genuinely connecting with a loved one. "I've been thinking we should sit down and talk about some practical things. Just to make sure you're prepared for whatever the future might bring." Practical things. Future preparations. The same euphemisms that had filled Robert's conversation with the estate planner. "What kind of practical things, Michael?" "Well, financial planning, mostly. Making sure your accounts are organized, your will is up to date, that sort of thing. It's just responsible planning, Mom." Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Except that my eldest son was also apparently participating in discussions about my incompetence and mortality. I appreciate your concern, honey, but I think my affairs are in good order. I'm sure they are, but it might be good to have a professional take a look. Someone who specializes in elder care planning. I've been doing some research, and there are some strategies that could really benefit you. Elder care planning. Strategies that could benefit me. Michael was using the same carefully neutral language that the estate planner had used, the kind of professional terminology that made their planning sound like a service rather than a takeover. What kind of strategies? Oh, things like protecting your assets, making sure you're not paying more taxes than necessary, ensuring that your medical care preferences are documented. Boring stuff, really, but important. Protecting my assets from whom, I wanted to ask. From my own poor judgment? From my declining mental capacity? From my stubborn refusal to accept that I was no longer competent to manage my own life? Michael, can I ask you something directly? There was a slight pause before he answered. Of course, Mom, you can ask me anything. Do you think I'm losing my mental faculties? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, why would you ask that? Because you're talking to me like I'm a confused elderly woman who needs to be protected from her own decisions. Is that how you see me? That's not how I see you at all, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I just think it's smart to plan ahead. None of us know what the future holds. You're right, I said quietly. None of us know what the future holds. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the calendar on my refrigerator. For years, that calendar had been filled with appointments and activities centered around my children's needs. Doctor visits scheduled around their availability to drive me. Social activities planned around their schedules. Even my own birthday celebrations had been organized to accommodate their convenience. Looking at it now, I saw the calendar of someone who had stopped living her own life and started existing as an accessory to other people's lives. Someone who had made herself so available, so accommodating, so selfless, that she'd become invisible even to herself. That night, I called Sandra in California. It was past 10 my time, but only 7 in San Diego, and I knew she'd be available. Sandra had always been my most independent child, the one who'd moved furthest away and visited least often. If anyone might be free of this apparent family conspiracy, it would be her. Mom! Sandra's voice was bright and cheerful. This is a nice surprise. How are you doing? I'm fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice and catch up. I'm so glad you called. Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. I'm planning to come home for a visit next month, and I was hoping we could spend some time discussing your long-term plans. My heart sank. Even Sandra, my independent daughter who lived 3,000 miles away, was apparently part of whatever coordinated effort my children had organized. What kind of long-term plans? Just practical stuff, Mom. Making sure you're set up for the future, that all your paperwork is in order, that kind of thing. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it's important. The same words, the same tone, the same careful euphemisms. They'd all been coached in how to approach me, how to frame their concerns in language that sounded caring rather than calculating. Sandra, have you been talking to your brothers about me? We talk sometimes, sure. We're all concerned about you, Mom. You're not getting any younger, and we want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of. Another euphemism for managed, controlled, stripped of autonomy in the name of protection. Who exactly do you think should be taking care of me? Well, we would, of course. That's what families do. And what would that look like exactly? This taking care of me? Sandra's voice became more cautious. I'm not sure what you mean, Mom. I mean, would I still be living in my own house, making my own decisions, managing my own money? Or would I be someone who needed permission and supervision and careful monitoring? Mom, you're talking like we're trying to put you in a nursing home or something. That's not what this is about at all. Then what is it about, Sandra? It's about making sure you're safe and secure and that your wishes are respected when you're not able to advocate for yourself anymore. When you're not able to advocate for yourself anymore, not if, when. As if my inability to speak for myself was an inevitable certainty rather than a hypothetical possibility. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. with Sandra using the same practiced language that Michael and Robert had used, the same carefully concerned tone that suggested loving children looking out for an aging parent. But underneath it all, I could hear the same assumption that had underlaid all their recent interactions with me, that I was declining, becoming incompetent, and would soon need to be managed like a child. After I hung up, I realized that all three of my children had been having conversations about me that I wasn't part of. They'd been making assessments about my mental state, my physical condition, my financial management, and my future needs, without involving me in any of those discussions. They'd been planning my life as if I were already too impaired to participate in decisions about my own existence. The most chilling part was how coordinated their approach had been. They'd all used similar language, raised similar concerns, and suggested similar solutions. This wasn't three children independently worrying about their mother. This was a planned intervention designed to convince me to surrender control of my life voluntarily. But why? What was driving this sudden concern about my competence and future planning? The answer came to me gradually over the next few days, as I began to pay closer attention to my interactions with my children. Every phone call included subtle questions about my daily activities, my health, my finances. Every visit involved careful observation of my house, my appearance, my behavior. They were gathering evidence, building a case, documenting my decline for purposes I was only beginning to understand. I started a journal that week, not the kind of sweet grandmother diary I might have kept to record family memories, but a detailed log of every interaction I had with my children. Every phone call, every visit, every question they asked, and every observation they made. I began to see patterns that had been invisible when I was focused on being the loving, accommodating mother they expected me to be. Michael's questions about my finances weren't motivated by concern for my security. They were motivated by concern about his inheritance. Sandra's suggestions about long-term planning weren't about respecting my wishes. They were about controlling my choices. Robert's offers to help with bills and paperwork weren't about making my life easier. They were about gathering evidence of my incompetence. My children hadn't suddenly become concerned about my well-being. They'd become concerned about protecting their financial interests from what they saw as my declining judgment and potentially costly decisions. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. They'd assumed that their mother was the same woman she'd always been, accommodating, trusting, eager to please, and completely focused on their needs rather than her own interests. They had no idea that the woman they were planning to manage, and eventually inherit from, had been listening to their plans, and was beginning to make some plans of her own. The devoted mother who had spent 71 years putting everyone else's needs first was about to discover what it felt like to put herself first for the very first time. And my children, who thought they knew exactly what kind of woman they were dealing with, were about to learn that they'd never really known their mother at all. They'd been planning for the future of a weak, confused, grateful elderly woman who would surrender her autonomy without a fight. Instead, they were about to meet Leslie Brown, a woman who'd spent 7 decades learning how to read people, manage situations, and get things done. The golden years they'd been planning to manage were about to become something entirely different, something that would teach them the difference between a mother who loves unconditionally and a woman who demands to be treated with respect. The education was about to begin, and tuition was going to be higher than they'd ever imagined. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, addressed to me in crisp, professional lettering that immediately caught my attention. The return address showed Peterson and Associates, estate planning attorneys, and my hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter informing me that my children had scheduled a family meeting to discuss my future care needs and financial security with their legal counsel present. The meeting was set for the following Thursday at 2 o'clock at Michael's house. The letter was polite, even deferential, but the underlying message was clear. Decisions were being made about my life, and my attendance was requested rather than my input being sought. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee growing cold in front of me. The formal language couldn't disguise what was happening. My children had hired an attorney to facilitate what they probably saw as an intervention, but what I recognized as an ambush. The past month had been illuminating in ways I never could have anticipated. Since discovering Robert's meeting with the estate planner, I'd been paying attention to my children's behavior with new eyes. And what I'd found was a carefully orchestrated campaign to establish my incompetence and their necessity as my caretakers. Michael had begun visiting more frequently, always with some pretext about helping me with paperwork or checking on repairs around the house. During each visit, he'd make subtle observations about my memory, my organization, my ability to manage daily tasks. When I couldn't immediately locate a utility bill he wanted to review, he'd comment on how important it was to keep documents organized. When I mentioned forgetting to return a library book on time, he'd suggest that keeping track of dates was becoming challenging for me. Sandra had started calling from California with increasing frequency, each conversation carefully probing my mental acuity and physical capabilities. She'd ask me to repeat information she'd already given me, then express concern when I asked for clarification. She'd inquire about my driving, my cooking, my social activities, always framing her questions as loving concern, but clearly documenting what she saw as signs of decline. Robert had become my most frequent visitor, stopping by several times a week under the guise of checking on me, but actually conducting what I now recognized as welfare assessments. He'd examine my refrigerator for expired food, review my mail for unpaid bills, observe my appearance for signs of self-neglect. When he found nothing genuinely concerning, he'd create problems by reorganizing my systems in ways that confused me, then point to my confusion as evidence that I was struggling to maintain my independence. But I'd been conducting my own investigation during those weeks, and what I'd discovered about my children's activities was far more disturbing than their amateur attempts at building a competency case against me. It had started when I decided to review my own financial records more carefully than I had in years. Frank had always handled our investments and major financial decisions, and after his death, I'd maintained the same accounts and strategies without much analysis. I trusted the statements that arrived each month, paid the fees that were deducted automatically, and assumed that everything was being managed in my best interests. But Michael's frequent questions about my financial management had made me curious about what exactly I was managing. So I'd spent several afternoons at the kitchen table with 8 years of bank statements, investment reports, and financial documents, creating a timeline of my assets and expenses since Frank's death. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 years ago, Michael had convinced me to add him as a joint account holder on my primary checking account, claiming it would make it easier for him to help me pay bills if I ever became ill or incapacitated. I'd agreed readily, trusting my eldest son completely and grateful for his willingness to assist me. But according to the bank statements, Michael had been making regular withdrawals from that account for the past 2 years. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there that could be explained as legitimate expenses he'd covered on my behalf. But the amounts had grown larger and more frequent over time. In the past 6 months alone, Michael had withdrawn over $12,000 from my account. The timing of these withdrawals corresponded with his visits to my house, when he'd offered to handle errands or pay bills for me. Instead of using his own money and asking for reimbursement, he'd been taking my money without my knowledge or consent. When I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with my own records, I discovered that Michael had been taking money for expenses that I'd already paid myself. He charged me for utility bills that I'd already covered, grocery shopping that I'd done independently, and home maintenance services that I'd neither requested nor received. My son had been systematically stealing from me while simultaneously building a case for my financial incompetence. The investigation into Sandra's activities required more creativity, since she lived across the country and had less direct access to my affairs. But her frequent questions about my property and belongings had made me suspicious, so I decided to research the public records related to my house. What I found was that Sandra had been in contact with real estate agents in Riverside, requesting market analyses and property evaluations for my address. She'd presented herself as my daughter who was helping me explore options for downsizing, and had received detailed reports about my home's current value and sale potential. More disturbing was the discovery that Sandra had been researching senior living facilities in the area, collecting brochures and pricing information for everything from independent living apartments to full-care nursing homes. She'd even gone so far as to schedule tours of several facilities, telling the administrators that she was exploring options for her elderly mother, who was beginning to need more support. Sandra had been pricing out my future living arrangements without my knowledge, apparently assuming that she would be making those decisions for me when the time came. Robert's betrayal was the most painful to uncover, perhaps because he lived closest, and I trusted him most completely. His frequent visits and offers of help had seemed like the natural concern of a loving son, but my new scrutiny revealed a more calculated purpose. I'd always given Robert a key to my house for emergencies, and I'd noticed that items occasionally seemed to be in slightly different places after his visits. I'd attributed this to my own forgetfulness, or to Robert's helpful nature in tidying up during his visits. But when I began paying closer attention, I realized that Robert had been systematically photographing my belongings. The discovery came when I found his phone in my kitchen after one of his visits. When I called to tell him he'd left it behind, he rushed over with an urgency that seemed excessive for someone simply retrieving a forgotten device. His obvious relief when I handed him the phone unexamined made me suspicious enough to start observing his behavior more carefully during subsequent visits. Robert had been documenting my possessions, creating a visual inventory of everything in my house, from furniture and artwork to jewelry and collectibles. He'd been particularly thorough in photographing items that might have significant value, and I realized that he'd been building a catalog of my estate for appraisal and distribution purposes. But the most shocking discovery came when I decided to check my credit report, something I hadn't done in years. Hidden among the routine information about my mortgage, credit cards, and utility accounts was a line of credit that I'd never opened, secured against my house, and currently carrying a balance of nearly $30,000. Further investigation revealed that this credit line had been opened 18 months ago using forged documents bearing my signature. The money had been withdrawn in increments over the past year and a half, always in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. The account was linked to Robert's personal bank account. My youngest son had committed identity theft and mortgage fraud, using my home as collateral for a loan that he'd been using to fund his own expenses, while simultaneously arguing that I was becoming too incompetent to manage my own finances. The irony was breathtaking. My children were stealing from me while building a case that I needed protection from my own poor judgment. They were committing fraud against me while arguing that they needed legal authority to protect my assets. They were systematically robbing me while positioning themselves as my concerned caretakers. Armed with this information, I spent the week before the scheduled family meeting consulting with my own attorney. Unlike my children, I didn't hire an estate planning specialist focused on managing elderly clients. I hired Margaret Chen, a criminal defense lawyer who specialized in financial fraud and elder abuse. Margaret was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to my story with growing amazement and anger. She reviewed the evidence I'd gathered with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen similar cases before. But she told me that the scope and coordination of my children's activities was unusually extensive. "Mrs. Brown," she said after reviewing my documentation, "what your children have done constitutes multiple felonies: identity theft, bank fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud. We're not talking about family disagreements or poor judgment. We're talking about serious crimes." She helped me understand my legal options, which ranged from criminal prosecution to civil recovery to protective orders that would prevent my children from accessing my accounts or property. But she also helped me understand something more important: the psychology of what my children had been doing. "They've convinced themselves that they're acting in your best interests," Margaret explained. "They probably genuinely believe that you're declining and that they're protecting you from yourself. The financial crimes are justified in their minds as early inheritance, money that will be theirs anyway. The manipulation and deception are rationalized as necessary protection of someone who can't protect herself." "But that's not what this is really about, is it?" I asked. "No," Margaret said bluntly. "This is about control and money. Your children have decided that you're more valuable to them as an incompetent dependent than as an autonomous adult. They've been working systematically to make that perception into reality." She helped me prepare for the family meeting in ways my children would never expect. Instead of arriving as the confused, grateful elderly woman they expected to manage, I would be arriving with legal representation, documented evidence of their crimes, and a clear understanding of my rights and options. But first, I wanted to understand exactly what they were planning to propose at this meeting. Margaret helped me arrange for a private investigator to conduct surveillance on Michael's house before the meeting, and what we discovered was that my children had been planning this confrontation for months. The investigators' report revealed that all three of my children had been meeting regularly at Michael's house, sometimes with the estate planning attorney I'd heard Robert talking to, sometimes with other professionals, including a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations. They'd been building not just a financial case against me, but a medical one as well. The psychiatrist had been briefed on my supposed symptoms of decline and was prepared to recommend a comprehensive evaluation that would likely result in a diagnosis of early dementia or cognitive impairment. The plan, as near as we could determine, was to present me with a fait accompli. They would express their loving concern for my well-being, present evidence of my declining capacity, and recommend that I voluntarily surrender control of my finances and major life decisions to a family trust managed by my children. If I refused, they were prepared to pursue legal guardianship with the testimony of the psychiatrists supporting their claim that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. The estate planning attorney would present this as the best possible outcome for everyone involved. I would be protected from my own poor judgment, my assets would be preserved and managed professionally, and my children would have the legal authority to make decisions about my care and living arrangements. What they hadn't planned for was the possibility that their elderly mother had been conducting her own investigation and had discovered their crimes. They had no idea that instead of arriving as a victim to be managed, I would be arriving as a prosecutor with evidence of their betrayal. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully in my most conservative navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Frank's funeral and other serious occasions. I arranged for Margaret to arrive separately, 30 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin. I wanted my children to have time to present their proposal before they learned that their intended victim had legal representation. I also wanted them to reveal the full scope of their plan before they discovered that I already knew about their crimes. Michael's house was in one of Riverside's most expensive neighborhoods, a sprawling colonial with a circular driveway and professionally maintained landscaping. I'd helped him with the down payment when he and Jennifer bought it 15 years ago, and I'd attended countless family gatherings in the formal living room where today's meeting was scheduled to take place. But as I pulled into the driveway, I wasn't feeling nostalgic about family memories. I was feeling like a prosecutor arriving to confront defendants who had no idea they'd been caught. Jennifer answered the door with a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hi, Mrs. Brown. Everyone's waiting in the living room." The living room had been arranged like a conference room, with chairs facing a central presentation area where Michael stood with a folder of documents. Sandra had flown in from California for the meeting, and Robert sat beside her on the sofa, both of them wearing expressions of concerned determination. The estate planning attorney was there as well, a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as James Peterson. There was also another man I didn't recognize, older and more scholarly looking, who was introduced as Dr. Richard Hoffman, a geriatric specialist. I was directed to an armchair that faced the group, positioned like a patient being evaluated rather than a family member being consulted. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "Mom," Michael began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this presentation. "We've asked you here today because we love you and we're concerned about your future. We've been noticing some changes lately," Sandra added, her voice gentle but firm. "Small things at first, but they're adding up to a pattern that worries us." Robert nodded in agreement. "Forgetfulness, confusion about bills and paperwork, some safety concerns around the house. We think it might be time to talk about getting you some additional support." I listened quietly as they presented their case against my competency. They had documented instances of my supposed confusion, examples of my alleged poor judgment, evidence of my declining ability to manage my own affairs. They spoke about me as if I weren't present, discussing my symptoms and limitations with the clinical detachment of medical professionals evaluating a patient. Dr. Hoffman contributed his expert opinion that the behaviors my children had described were consistent with early cognitive decline, possibly the beginning stages of dementia. He recommended a comprehensive evaluation to determine the extent of my impairment and the level of support I would need. James Peterson then presented the legal solution they'd developed: a family trust that would manage my assets, a power of attorney arrangement that would give my children authority over my major decisions, and a care plan that would ensure my safety and well-being as my condition deteriorated. They painted it as a loving intervention designed to protect me from myself, while preserving my dignity and ensuring that my final years would be comfortable and secure. They emphasized that I would still have input into decisions about my life, but that my children would have the final authority to override my choices if they deemed them unsafe or unwise. Throughout the presentation, they all watched me carefully for signs of confusion, agitation, or resistance that would support their narrative of an elderly woman whose judgment could no longer be trusted. When they finished, Michael leaned forward with an expression of compassionate concern. "Mom, we know this is a lot to process, and we don't expect you to make any decisions today. But we want you to understand that we're here to help you, and we'll make sure you're taken care of no matter what." "That's very thoughtful of you," I said quietly. "All of you have put so much effort into planning my future. I'm curious, though, about a few details." I opened my purse and pulled out a folder of my own, the one containing bank statements, legal documents, and investigation reports that I'd compiled over the past month. "Michael, I have some questions about these withdrawals from my checking account. Could you help me understand what these payments were for?" I handed him copies of the bank statements with his unauthorized withdrawals highlighted in yellow. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what he was looking at. "And Sandra, I found these real estate evaluations for my property that were apparently requested by you. When were you planning to discuss selling my house with me?" Sandra's confident composure cracked as I placed the property reports on the coffee table in front of her. "Robert, this credit line secured against my house is particularly interesting. Could you explain how my signature ended up on loan documents that I never signed?" Robert's hands were visibly shaking as he stared at the mortgage fraud documentation. The room fell completely silent. Dr. Hoffman looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly unaware that his expert consultation was based on fabricated symptoms provided by children who were committing crimes against their mother. James Peterson was frantically reviewing his notes, probably trying to determine his liability for participating in what was now obviously a fraudulent scheme. "But the most interesting thing I discovered," I continued, my voice growing stronger and more confident, "is how coordinated your efforts have been. You've been meeting regularly to plan this intervention. You've been sharing information about my supposed decline, and you've been working together to position yourselves as my necessary caretakers." I stood up and faced my 3 children, seeing them clearly for the first time in years, not as the loving family I'd sacrificed everything for, but as the calculating strangers they'd revealed themselves to be. "What you haven't realized is that while you were planning to take control of my life and assets, you were also committing multiple felonies: identity theft, bank fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence is all documented, and it's all been reviewed by my attorney." As if on cue, Margaret knocked on the front door. Jennifer let her in with obvious bewilderment, and Margaret entered the living room with the commanding presence of someone who was very good at her job. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, addressing the group with professional courtesy. "I'm Margaret Chen, Mrs. Brown's legal counsel. I believe we need to discuss some criminal matters that have come to light." The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. My children, who moments before had been confidently presenting their case for managing my incompetent life, suddenly found themselves facing criminal charges for the fraudulent schemes they'd been operating behind my back. Dr. Hoffman excused himself immediately, clearly wanting no part of what had become a criminal matter. James Peterson began gathering his papers with obvious panic, probably wondering how he'd become involved in what was apparently elder abuse disguised as estate planning. But my children just sat in stunned silence, staring at me as if they were seeing a stranger. The confused, declining elderly woman they'd been planning to manage had been replaced by someone they'd never met. Leslie Brown, criminal prosecutor. "Mom," Michael said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" "I'm protecting myself from people who've been stealing from me while convincing themselves they're acting in my best interests," I replied. "I'm standing up for myself against children who've been planning to take control of my life without my consent." "We were trying to help you," Sandra protested, tears starting to form in her eyes. "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to help yourselves. To my money, to my property, to control over my life. You convinced yourselves it was for my benefit, but it was really for yours." Robert was crying openly now. "Mom, please. We love you. We were just worried about you." "If you loved me," I said, looking at each of them in turn, You would have talked to me about your concerns instead of investigating me like criminals. You would have asked for my input instead of planning my future behind my back. You would have respected my autonomy instead of working to destroy it. Margaret stepped forward with a folder of legal documents. We have several options for how to proceed, she announced. Criminal prosecution, civil recovery, or a negotiated settlement that avoids public charges in exchange for full restitution and cessation of all unauthorized activities. My children looked at each other in panic. They'd gone from confident intervention leaders to defendants in a criminal case in the span of 30 minutes. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one more revelation that would completely upend their understanding of their situation. There's something else you should know, I said, my voice calm and steady. While you've been planning to manage my assets and control my life, I've been making some plans of my own. I pulled out one final document from my folder and placed it on the coffee table where they could all see it. This is my new will, I announced. Updated last week with Margaret's assistance. You'll notice that it differs significantly from my previous will. Michael reached for the document with trembling hands and read the first page. His face went completely white. You've disinherited us, he whispered. Not exactly, I corrected. I've left each of you exactly what you've demonstrated you think I'm worth. Nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. My children stared at the will, at each other, at me, trying to process what had just happened. Instead, I continued, my assets will be going to establish the Leslie Brown Foundation for Elder Rights, which will provide legal assistance to elderly people whose families are attempting to exploit or control them. Sandra was sobbing now. Mom, please. We made mistakes, but we're family. You can't just erase us from your life. You erased yourselves from my life when you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive, I replied. When you started planning my funeral while I was still breathing. When you chose money over love. Robert fell to his knees beside my chair. Mom, please. We'll make this right. We'll pay back every penny. We'll never interfere in your life again. Please don't do this. I looked down at my youngest son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep as a baby, the child I'd comforted through nightmares and heartbreaks and disappointments, the man who had stolen my identity to fund his lifestyle while building a case for my incompetence. Robert, I said gently, you can't make this right. You can't undo the months of planning my downfall. You can't erase the meetings where you discussed my timeline and calculated my remaining value. You can't take back the decision to see me as an asset instead of your mother. I stood up and gathered my papers, preparing to leave the house where my children had planned to strip me of my autonomy and dignity. The foundation will be announced next week, I told them. The local newspaper is doing a feature story about elder abuse and financial exploitation. You'll probably want to avoid being quoted in that article. As I walked toward the door, Michael called after me desperately. Mom, what are we supposed to do now? I turned back to look at my 3 children one last time. They looked broken, defeated, completely unprepared for the consequences of their actions. I suggest you learn to live on what you earn instead of what you think you're going to inherit, I said. And maybe consider whether there are other elderly people in your lives who deserve better treatment than you gave your mother. Outside in my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. My children had seen me as a declining asset to be managed until I died and they could inherit my wealth. Instead, they'd learned that their mother was a force to be reckoned with, someone who would fight for her dignity and her rights, regardless of who was trying to take them away. The foundation I'd established would ensure that my legacy would be about empowering elderly people, rather than enriching ungrateful children. My story would become a cautionary tale about the price of taking your parents' love for granted. As I drove home to my house, my garden, my life that belonged entirely to me, I realized that my children had given me something valuable after all. They'd given me the motivation to discover who Leslie Brown could be when she stopped trying to be the perfect mother to people who saw her perfection as weakness. The woman driving home that day was not the same woman who had baked apple pies and made excuses for her children's cruelty. She was someone stronger. Someone who understood that love without respect is not love at all. And she was someone who would never again mistake being needed for being valued. 6 months had passed since that devastating afternoon at Michael's house, And I was sitting in my living room reading the morning newspaper when the article appeared that would complete my transformation from victim to victor. The headline read, "Local woman establishes foundation after surviving family financial abuse," and beneath it was a photograph of me standing in front of the new offices of the Leslie Brown Foundation for Elder Rights. The reporter had done an excellent job telling my story without sensationalizing it, focusing on the broader issue of elder financial abuse, while using my experience as an example of how families can exploit their aging relatives under the guise of care and concern. The article mentioned that my own children had been involved in the scheme but didn't name them specifically, though anyone in Riverside who knew our family would easily make the connection. I set the newspaper aside and walked to my kitchen to pour another cup of coffee, moving through my house with a sense of ownership and peace that I hadn't felt in years. Everything here belonged to me, was chosen by me, existed for my pleasure and comfort rather than someone else's convenience. The silence that had once felt lonely now felt like freedom. The changes in my life since discovering my children's betrayal had been dramatic and mostly wonderful. I'd sold Frank's business equipment that had been gathering dust in the garage and used the money to travel to places I'd always wanted to see but had never prioritized, while I was busy taking care of everyone else. I'd taken a cruise through the Mediterranean, spent 2 weeks in Ireland tracing my family's genealogy, and visited Sandra's city of San Diego, though I stayed in a hotel, rather than imposing on a daughter who no longer spoke to me. The house had been updated to reflect my preferences, rather than maintaining it as a shrine to family memories that had proven to be largely one-sided. I'd redecorated Frank's office as a reading room, filled with books I actually wanted to read, rather than the practical manuals and business documents that had accumulated over the years. The children's bedrooms had been converted into a guest room and a craft room where I'd rediscovered my love of quilting, something I'd abandoned when the demands of motherhood consumed all my creative energy. Most importantly, I'd learned to fill my days with activities that brought me personal satisfaction, rather than serving other people's needs. I volunteered at the library teaching literacy classes to adults, served on the board of the local women's shelter, and had even started taking piano lessons, something I'd always wanted to do but had never had time for when my schedule revolved around everyone else's priorities. The foundation had become my primary focus and greatest source of pride. With Margaret's help, I'd established a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to elderly people whose families were exploiting them. We'd already helped dozens of seniors escape situations similar to mine, and the demand for our services had grown so rapidly that we'd hired 3 additional staff members and were planning to expand to neighboring counties. The work was deeply meaningful in ways that cooking elaborate family dinners and maintaining a perfect house had never been. Every elderly person we helped felt like a small victory against the assumption that aging parents exist primarily to serve their adult children's financial interests. Every case we won established precedent that elderly people have rights that must be respected regardless of their children's convenience. But the most satisfying aspect of my new life was the discovery that I was actually quite capable of living independently and making my own decisions. Far from the declining, confused woman my children had described to their estate planning attorney, I'd proven to be sharp, competent, and perfectly able to manage my own affairs. The freedom to make choices based on my own preferences rather than someone else's expectations had been intoxicating. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reflection. I wasn't expecting visitors, and I'd grown cautious about unexpected callers since the foundation had begun receiving attention in the media. Some people supported what we were doing, but others saw us as troublemakers interfering in family matters that should be resolved privately. Through the window, I could see a familiar figure standing on my front porch, though it took me a moment to recognize him. Robert looked older than his 39 years, his face drawn and his posture defeated in a way that spoke of months of stress and consequence. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Hello, Robert." "Hi, Mom." His voice was hoarse, uncertain. "Could we talk, please?" I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation and calculation that had characterized our interactions for so long before I discovered his true intentions. What I saw instead was genuine desperation and what appeared to be sincere remorse. "What do you want to talk about?" "About what I did. About what we all did. about how sorry I am and how much I've lost because of my stupidity. I considered sending him away. For months, I'd ignored phone calls, returned letters unopened, and refused to engage with any of my children's attempts to contact me. Margaret had advised that any communication with them could be seen as an opening for renewed manipulation or legal challenges to the foundation. But something in Robert's demeanor suggested that this wasn't another calculated attempt to access my resources. This looked like a man who had genuinely hit bottom and was trying to find his way back to some semblance of human decency. "You have 15 minutes, I said, stepping aside to let him enter. He walked into my living room and looked around with obvious surprise. The changes I'd made to the house were subtle but significant, and Robert was seeing them for the first time. The formal family portraits had been replaced with landscapes I'd purchased during my travels. The furniture had been rearranged to create conversation areas rather than the presentation spaces that had been designed for hosting family gatherings. "The house looks different," he said quietly. "I'm different," I replied. "I'm living here for myself now instead of maintaining it as a museum for people who never appreciated it." Robert sat heavily in one of the chairs, and I could see that he was struggling not to cry. "Mom, I've lost everything. Tracy filed for divorce last month. She found out about the loan I took against your house, about all the lies I told her about our finances. She's moving back to her mother's with the kids, and I don't know when I'll see them again." I felt a flicker of sympathy for my grandchildren, but not for Robert. His wife had made a smart decision to protect herself and her children from a man who had proven himself capable of financial fraud and systematic deception. "I'm sorry your family is suffering," I said carefully, "but that's a consequence of choices you made." "I know," Robert said quickly. "I'm not asking for your sympathy or your help. I just wanted you to know how much I regret what I did, and to tell you that I understand why you can't forgive me." "Do you understand it, Robert? Do you really understand what you did to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I thought I was being practical. I told myself that the money would be mine eventually anyway, so borrowing against it early wasn't really stealing. I convinced myself that you were getting confused and forgetful, that you needed us to make decisions for you. But that wasn't true, was it? "No," he whispered. "You were fine. You were managing everything perfectly well on your own. We created problems that didn't exist, so we could justify taking control." I watched him struggle with this admission, recognizing perhaps for the first time the magnitude of what he and his siblings had attempted to do to me. "Robert, do you understand that you weren't just stealing money from me? You were stealing my autonomy, my dignity, my right to control my own life." "I do now," he said, tears finally beginning to fall. "I've spent months thinking about how it must have felt to discover that your own children saw you as nothing more than an inheritance waiting to happen. How it must have felt to realize that we were planning your life around your death. And how do you think it felt?" Robert looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Like the worst kind of betrayal. Like everything you'd given us, everything you'd sacrificed for us meant nothing. Like we saw you as valuable only when you were dead." I nodded slowly. This was the first time any of my children had demonstrated genuine understanding of the emotional impact of their actions, rather than simply regretting the financial consequences. "That's exactly how it felt," I confirmed. Like 45 years of motherhood had been reduced to a bank balance and a real estate evaluation. "Mom, is there anything I can do to earn your forgiveness? Any way to prove that I understand how wrong I was?" I had thought about this question many times over the past months. All three of my children had made various attempts to contact me, each trying different approaches to reestablish some kind of relationship. Michael had tried anger, claiming I was being vindictive and destroying the family over money. Sandra had tried guilt, insisting that I was punishing her for mistakes that had been motivated by love and concern. But Robert was the first to acknowledge the full scope of what they'd done, and to accept responsibility without trying to minimize or justify their actions. "Robert, forgiveness isn't something you can earn back with good behavior. It's something I give for my own peace of mind, not because you've proven you deserve it. Have you forgiven me?" I considered the question honestly. I've stopped being angry with you. I've stopped letting what you did control my emotions or determine my happiness. If that's forgiveness, then yes, I suppose I've forgiven you. Relief flooded his face. "Does that mean we can have a relationship again?" Can I be your son again? You'll always be my son, Robert. But you can't be my child anymore. That relationship was based on my unlimited availability and your unlimited access to my resources. That dynamic is over permanently. What kind of relationship can we have? The kind that adults have with each other, based on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and earning each other's trust through consistent behavior over time. Robert nodded eagerly. I'll do anything you want. I'll follow any rules you set. I just want to be part of your life again. The first rule is that you stop wanting things from me. Stop seeing me as someone who exists to meet your needs or solve your problems. Stop approaching me as a resource to be utilized. I can do that. The second rule is that you respect my autonomy completely. My decisions about my money, my house, my activities, my relationships are mine to make. You can offer opinions if I ask for them, but you have no authority over my choices. Of course. The third rule is that you earn back trust gradually through consistent honesty over time. That means no lies, no manipulation, no hidden agendas. It means accepting that there may be consequences for your past actions that you can't avoid or minimize. Robert was nodding frantically, desperate to agree to anything that might restore some connection between us. And the fourth rule, I continued, is that you understand that this relationship will be different from the one we had before. I won't be your safety net, your problem solver, or your financial backup plan. I'll be your mother, but I'll also be my own person with my own life and priorities. I understand, Robert said. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm grateful you're willing to give me one. I studied his face, trying to determine whether his repentance was genuine or another form of manipulation designed to regain access to my resources. But something in his demeanor convinced me that his remorse was real, and that he had genuinely learned something from the consequences of his actions. Robert, I need you to understand something important. Even if we rebuild some kind of relationship, even if you prove yourself trustworthy over time, even if you become the son I always hoped you could be, it won't change my will. His face fell slightly, but he nodded. I understand. The foundation will still inherit my assets. That decision isn't punishment for past behavior that you can undo with future good behavior. It's a choice I've made about how I want my legacy to be used. I think what you're doing with the foundation is amazing, Robert said, and I could hear genuine admiration in his voice. I've been reading about the people you've helped, and I'm proud that my mother is making such a difference in the world. This was new. For the first time in our conversation, Robert was expressing pride in my accomplishments, rather than focusing on his own needs or desires. It was a small shift, but it suggested that he might be capable of seeing me as a person rather than just a parent. Thank you, I said simply. That means more to me than you might realize. We talked for another hour, with Robert telling me about his job prospects, his attempts to rebuild his relationship with his children, and his efforts to understand how he'd allowed himself to become someone capable of stealing from his own mother. He didn't ask for money, advice, or help with his problems. He just talked to me like one adult talking to another, sharing his struggles without expecting me to solve them. When he was ready to leave, he hugged me gently and thanked me for giving him a chance to apologize properly. Mom, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I see you clearly now. Not as my mother who exists to take care of me, but as Leslie Brown, who's an amazing woman in her own right. After he left, I sat in my living room thinking about the conversation and what it might mean for our future relationship. Robert had demonstrated genuine understanding of his mistakes and apparent commitment to change, but I'd learned to be cautious about accepting people's promises at face value. Still, there was something different about this interaction that gave me hope that my youngest son might be capable of growth and genuine change. Unlike his siblings who had focused primarily on the financial consequences of their actions, Robert seemed to understand the emotional and moral dimensions of what they'd done to me. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed the number for the foundation office, and I answered to hear our legal coordinator's excited voice. Mrs. Brown, you're not going to believe the call I just received. The State Attorney General's office wants to meet with us about expanding our services statewide. Apparently, our success rate and media coverage have caught their attention, and they're interested in providing funding for a much larger operation. I felt a surge of pride and satisfaction that was deeper than anything I'd experienced during my years of devoted motherhood. The foundation wasn't just helping individual elderly people escape exploitation. It was becoming a model for protecting elderly rights on a broader scale. That's wonderful news, I said. Schedule the meeting and let me know what documentation they'll need. There's more, she continued. The reporter who wrote the article about you has been contacted by a publisher who's interested in having you write a book about elder abuse and financial exploitation. They think your story could help other elderly people recognize the warning signs and protect themselves. A book. The idea of sharing my experience more broadly, of potentially helping thousands of elderly people avoid what I'd been through, was both exciting and daunting. I'll think about it, I said. Let me know what kind of timeline they're considering. After I hung up, I realized that my life had become fuller and more meaningful than it had ever been when it revolved around my children's needs. The foundation work was challenging and important in ways that cooking elaborate family dinners had never been. The possibility of writing a book offered the chance to make a difference on a scale I'd never imagined when my world was limited to managing household schedules and family gatherings. I'd discovered that being needed by people who respected my expertise and valued my contributions was entirely different from being needed by people who took my availability for granted. The elderly clients we helped at the foundation saw me as a powerful advocate and trusted advisor. The staff members looked to me for leadership and guidance. The media treated me as an expert on issues that mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I was valued for my knowledge, my skills, and my judgment, rather than for my willingness to sacrifice my own interests for other people's convenience. The doorbell rang again, and this time I could see Michael's car in my driveway through the window. Unlike Robert's defeated posture, Michael's stance suggested anger and determination. He'd been the most resistant to accepting the consequences of their failed scheme, and I suspected this visit would be less pleasant than Robert's. "Mother," Michael said when I opened the door, his tone formal and cold. "We need to discuss your recent media appearances and the damage you're doing to this family's reputation." I didn't invite him in. "I'm not damaging this family's reputation, Michael. I'm telling the truth about what happened to me. If that damages your reputation, perhaps you should consider why. You're making us look like criminals. You are criminals. You committed multiple felonies against me, and the only reason you're not in prison is because I chose not to pursue prosecution." Michael's jaw tightened. "We were trying to help you. Everything we did was motivated by concern for your well-being." I looked at my eldest son, this man I'd once been so proud of, and felt nothing but sadness for his inability to acknowledge the truth about his actions. "Michael, do you really believe that? Do you honestly think that stealing from my bank account was for my benefit? That forging loan documents was protective care? That planning to have me declared incompetent was loving concern? We were protecting you from yourself. You're 71 years old, Mother. You can't live independently forever. I'm living independently quite successfully right now. I'm traveling, volunteering, running a foundation, and managing my own affairs without any assistance from you. What exactly do you think I need protection from? From making poor decisions about your money? From being taken advantage of by people who want to exploit you?" The irony was breathtaking. Michael was arguing that I needed protection from exploitation, while having spent months exploiting me himself. "The only people who have ever exploited me are my own children," I said quietly. "The only people who have ever taken advantage of my trust are the three of you. That's not fair. It's completely fair. You saw me as a source of money rather than as a person. You planned my future without consulting me. You worked to strip me of my autonomy and dignity. If that's not exploitation, what is?" Michael was quiet for a moment, perhaps recognizing that his arguments weren't persuasive even to himself. "What do you want from us, Mother? What would it take for you to forgive us and restore our family? I want you to understand that our family was destroyed the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. I want you to recognize that love isn't something you can restore with apologies after you've revealed that it never really existed in the first place. Of course we love you. No, Michael. You love what I represented to you. Financial security, inheritance, someone to solve your problems and meet your needs. But you don't love me as a person, because you've never seen me as a person. That's not true. Prove it. Tell me something about who I am apart from being your mother. Tell me about my interests, my dreams, my opinions, my preferences. Tell me anything about Leslie Brown, the individual, rather than Mrs. Frank Brown or Michael's mother. Michael stared at me, and I could see him struggling to answer the question. After 71 years of life and 45 years of being his mother, my eldest son couldn't think of a single thing to say about who I was as a person. You can't, can you? I said gently. Because you've never bothered to know me as anything other than your resource. I want to know you, Michael said desperately. I want to learn who you are. I want to have a real relationship with you. That's what Robert said, and I'm giving him a chance to prove it. But Michael, you're going to have to start by acknowledging what you actually did instead of continuing to pretend it was motivated by love. I acknowledge that we made mistakes. Not mistakes, crimes. Deliberate, calculated, systematic crimes committed against someone who trusted you completely. Michael's face flushed with anger. Fine. We committed crimes. We stole from you. We lied to you. We tried to control you. Is that what you want to hear? I want to hear that you understand why those actions were wrong, not just that you're sorry you got caught. They were wrong because they hurt you. They were wrong because they treated you like an object rather than a person. They were wrong because they violated your rights and your dignity. They were wrong because they reduced 45 years of motherhood to a financial transaction. Michael was crying now, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he and his siblings had attempted to do. Mother, please, I'll do anything to make this right. I'll pay back every penny I took. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever you want. I want you to rebuild your life based on your own efforts, rather than what you expected to inherit from me. I want you to learn to see elderly people, including your mother, as human beings deserving of respect, rather than resources to be managed. And then will you forgive me? I looked at Michael, this man who had once been my baby, my pride and joy, my hope for the future. The man who had grown up to see me as valuable, only for what I could provide him financially. I hope someday you'll understand that forgiveness isn't something you earn as a reward for good behavior. It's something I give for my own peace, regardless of whether you deserve it. Have you forgiven me? I've stopped letting what you did control my happiness. I've stopped defining my worth by your opinion of me. I've stopped waiting for you to become the son I hoped you could be. That sounds like you've given up on me. No, Michael. I've given up on the fantasy that our relationship was based on love rather than utility. But if you can learn to see me as a person rather than a parent, if you can respect my autonomy rather than trying to control me, if you can value my well-being rather than just your inheritance, then maybe we can build something real. Michael nodded through his tears. I want to try. Then start by supporting the foundation instead of seeing it as competition for your inheritance. Start by respecting my choices instead of questioning my judgment. Start by visiting me because you enjoy my company, rather than because you want something from me. After Michael left, I realized that both of my sons had expressed desire to rebuild our relationships, though from very different emotional starting points. Robert seemed to understand the full scope of what they'd done, and was approaching our potential relationship with appropriate humility. Michael was still struggling to move beyond seeing me primarily as his mother rather than as an individual, but he seemed willing to make the effort. Sandra, however, had not contacted me at all since the confrontation at Michael's house. According to Robert, she was still living in California and had told her brothers that she considered me vindictive and unreasonable for refusing to accept their apologies and restore their inheritance. I found I didn't miss any of them the way I'd expected to. The fear of losing my children's love had controlled so many of my decisions over the years. But now that I'd actually lost their version of love, I discovered that it had never been worth the sacrifices I'd made to maintain it. Real love, I'd learned, involved respect, consideration, and genuine concern for the other person's well-being. What my children had felt for me was dependency, entitlement, and possessiveness disguised as affection. The relationships I'd built through the foundation work were based on mutual respect and shared values. The elderly clients appreciated my advocacy because I was effective, not because I was their mother. The staff members valued my leadership because I was competent. not because I was related to them. The media sought my expertise because I had knowledge worth sharing, not because I was obligated to provide it. For the first time in my adult life, I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide, and the difference was transformative. The phone rang again, and this time it was Margaret calling with an update about the publisher's offer. "They're serious about the book," she reported. "They're offering a substantial advance and a platform for speaking engagements. They think your story could become a movement." A movement. The idea that my experience could inspire other elderly people to stand up for their rights, to recognize their own worth, to refuse to be treated as burdens or resources, was both thrilling and overwhelming. What would that involve? Writing your story, obviously, but also traveling to speak at conferences, appearing on television programs, maybe testifying before legislative committees about elder abuse laws. I thought about the woman I'd been just months ago, who had measured her worth by how well she served her children's needs and how perfectly she maintained their childhood home. That woman would never have imagined herself as an author, a speaker, or an advocate for other people's rights. But that woman had been erased the moment her children handed her those estate planning documents disguised as loving concern. In her place had emerged someone stronger, someone who understood that respect must be demanded rather than hoped for, someone who knew that dignity was not negotiable. "Schedule a meeting with them," I told Margaret. "I think it's time for Leslie Brown to tell her story to the world." That evening, I sat in my reading room with a cup of tea and my journal, documenting the day's events and my thoughts about the future. The house was quiet around me, but it was the peaceful quiet of solitude, rather than the empty quiet of abandonment. Through my window, I could see the garden I'd planted entirely for my own pleasure, filled with flowers I loved rather than vegetables my children needed. The reading lamp beside my chair illuminated books I'd chosen for my own interest rather than magazines that helped me stay current on my grandchildren's activities. Everything in my life now existed for my own satisfaction and reflected my own choices. It was a kind of freedom I'd never experienced, even as a young woman, because I'd gone directly from my parents' expectations to Frank's needs, to my children's demands without ever discovering what Leslie Brown wanted for herself. The foundation work had shown me that I was capable of leadership, strategy, and making a meaningful difference in the world. The possibility of writing a book offered the chance to share what I'd learned with other elderly people who might be facing similar exploitation. The speaking engagements would allow me to advocate for changes in laws and attitudes that could protect vulnerable seniors. I was about to become busier and more purposeful than I'd ever been when my schedule revolved around other people's needs. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children had tried to take control of my life because they assumed I was declining and becoming less capable. Instead, their betrayal had forced me to discover capabilities I'd never developed while I was focused on serving their needs. They'd seen me as a diminishing asset to be managed until I died. Instead, I'd become a force for social change, whose influence would outlive me. They'd calculated my worth based on my bank balance and real estate holdings. Instead, I'd learned that my true value lay in my ability to help other people protect their rights and dignity. My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert. "Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize properly. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become." I smiled as I read his message. It was the first time any of my children had expressed pride in who I was, rather than gratitude for what I'd provided. Perhaps there was hope for rebuilding something real, with at least one of them. Perhaps Robert could learn to see me as Leslie Brown, advocate and author and force for change, rather than just as his mother who existed to meet his needs. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by discovering the truth about my children's intentions. The betrayal that should have destroyed me had instead liberated me from relationships that were based on exploitation rather than love. Tomorrow, I would begin working on my book, sharing my story with the hope that other elderly people might recognize the warning signs of family financial abuse before it was too late. I would continue building the foundation that was helping seniors protect their rights and dignity. I would speak to media outlets about the reality of elder exploitation and the need for stronger legal protections. I would live as Leslie Brown, a woman whose worth was measured by her contributions to the world rather than her willingness to sacrifice herself for other people's convenience. My children had thought I had nothing left to give them except an inheritance. They'd had no idea that what I had left them was a lesson in the consequences of taking someone's love for granted. They'd assumed I would gratefully accept their management of my declining years. Instead, I'd shown them what an elderly woman could accomplish when she refused to be diminished. They'd planned my future around my death. Instead, I'd created a legacy that would outlive us all. The woman who fell asleep that night was not the same woman who had baked apple pies for ungrateful children and maintained a perfect house for people who saw it only as future real estate. She was someone who had learned that respect must be earned, that love without dignity is not love at all, and that it's never too late to discover who you're meant to be when you stop trying to be what everyone else needs you to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.